So I know after graduation, it's really hard to figure out if you want to go and get an advanced degree, like a master's degree or a PhD, or if you want to start working in the industry. If you're a long-time listener, you know I have explored this topic in previous episodes where I give you 4 reasons you should go to graduate school and 4 reasons you should not go to graduate school, as well as conversation with one of my friends that did not ended up going to graduate school, and we compare our careers and see how far we are and the difference in terms of I wouldn't say like a lot of technical knowledge, but how our experience vary from having a master's degree and not having a master's degree. So if you have not listened to the episodes, I'll make sure and link them in the show notes of this episode at luisfelipeduque.com/038, as well as all the relevant resources we're going to be talking about on this episode. So the guest for today is a person that has a lot of experience on this topic. She has 2 master's degree and a PhD program. And she also has a lot of things going on the side. She has her own podcast, her own blog, talking about PhD and helping PhD students succeed in their careers and giving them all the tools and resources they need to succeed. So when she reached out to be a guest in this podcast, I was really excited. She has a lot of great things to share with us, and she has a lot of experience on the industry side as well, which is very interesting. And we kind of touched a little bit on that, as well as giving you a lot of resources on managing your time as a PhD student. But even if you're not a PhD student, you are a working engineer, there is still a lot of knowledge to gain from her. And she has a lot of really cool tools she uses and a lot of cool methods and techniques that I was very impressed, because she does a lot of things at the university where she teaches, as well as with research, with all the activities outside of work, and with her blog and podcast as well. So very interesting episode, and I was very happy to talk to her today. So welcome back to another episode of the Engineering Future podcast. I am your host, Luis Duque, and this week I talked to Dr Lantsoght. She's a professor at a university in Quito, as well as a university in the Netherlands. She has her own podcast, the PhD Talks, as well as a blog where she shares all the great things around PhD, how to do this really hard research, and overall just a lot of great things helping PhD students succeed in their research. She also has a lot of design work, including structural and bridge engineering in Belgium, and working as an independent consultant in structural engineering in Ecuador. She's an active member of the technical committees of the Transportation Research Board in concrete bridges, and the secretary of the testing and evaluation of transportation structures. She also does a lot of great things, but please go to the show notes at luisfelipeduque.com/038 to see all the great committees she's part of. Committees in concrete, torsion, a lot of structure, a lot of really technical committees. So if that's something that you enjoy and something that you're very passionate about, make sure you reach out to her, make sure you go to her blog, and make sure you listen to her podcast, because she's sharing a lot of great things about all the work that she's doing right now, doing research and just educating everyone else around their careers, as well as all the things that she learned doing her 2 masters and her PhD as an international student here in the US, and now working internationally with different research and different activities, and how that varies from doing a PhD here in the US. So overall, a great episode. Overall, we learned a lot of great things, and I was very happy to have Dr. Lantsoght today here on the podcast. So before we start today's episode, I just want to ask you, are you enjoying this podcast? Are you enjoying the content that I'm putting out there for you? Are you enjoying all the guests that I'm bringing? And is it helping you in your career? I'm curious to know. The best way to know is just sending me a message, reaching out on social media, but also rate and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts. Giving an honest review. I read every single one of them, and it really helps me increase the quality of the show and bring you the content that you want to hear, because this podcast is all about you. This podcast is helping you create a career that is meaningful and finding purpose in everything you do in your career. So please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It just takes a couple of minutes. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can find it super easy. It really helps me, and I just want to say thank you for listening. And without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation for today. Welcome to the Engineering Our Future podcast, a podcast where I bring you relevant content from personal experience and guests to help young engineers, students, and international students succeed in their careers. So welcome, Eva, to another episode of the Engineering Future podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your PhD experience. I know you're doing a professorship right now and research and a lot of great things in structural engineering. So I'm happy to get you here in the podcast. So do you want to start maybe on a little bit on that trajectory of being a professor? And I'm sure you went through like the PhD program and research and maybe some of the topics you're doing right now.
hmm Sure. So I'm originally from Belgium and I studied first at the University of Brussels, the Vrije Universiteit Brussel in uh, the city of Brussels, where I did my first master's, which was in civil. And then I went to Georgia Tech in the United States with funding from the Belgian American Educational Foundation, as well as the Fulbright to do my master's in structures. And after that, I went to the Netherlands for doing my PhD to Delft University of Technology. And after getting my PhD, I went to Ecuador to Universidad San Francisco de Quito, where now I'm a full professor, and I remained affiliated to Delft University of Technology, where at the moment I am a part-time tenured assistant professor. So the topics that I work on are all related to the question on what we can do to make sure that our existing bridges are safe and fulfill the code requirements, and what we can do to extend their service life. So within that, I look at problems related to shear in concrete slab bridges. I look at fatigue problems. I look at load testing of bridges, really a lot of different topics as they sound, but the overarching idea is to for me is to do research in service of society and research in service to the existing bridges.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and just the fact that you're in Ecuador, I'm from Colombia, so it's kind of fun to hear that you're doing all this research. I know I think you also teach at the Netherlands, but doing all this research at these universities, and I'm sure it's been an adjustment as well. Do you want to start with just talking about kind of the PhD programs and maybe what should students consider before getting into a PhD program, especially if they are finishing like the undergrad and maybe they want to jump into a master's degree or straight into PhD, and uh, what does that look like for students?
Sure, that's of course a very big topic. And the first thing to address here is that the PhD program and what it looks like depends a lot on the country and the university. So, doing a PhD in the Netherlands may be a different experience from doing a PhD in the United States. And I guess that most of the listeners are based in the United States. So, I do want to shed a little bit of light on the difference with some other types of PhD programs that are out there, such as the type
Mhm.
of program that is common in the Netherlands. And while in the United States, you have the PhD, which has a large chunk of coursework, and then in perspective, slightly less research. In the Netherlands, the PhD really is virtually everything research for a full duration of 4 years. So they tend to be a little bit
Oh,
longer as well, the PhD programs in the Netherlands. So when making that choice, what you want to do, it also depends on the type of program that you're heading to. Some people are, for example, going to Germany for their PhD, and that's as well more similar to the Dutch PhD, which is longer, heavier in research perhaps, and maybe a little bit less structured than what you would have in the United States. So that in itself is a consideration for people to see where they would apply and go to if they would be interested as well in international
mhm.
experience. Now, to come back to your question on what to consider when you are an undergrad and think maybe I want to go do a, a graduate degree, perhaps master's and then PhD, or a track towards the PhD directly. I would say a lot of it depends really on what you're trying to go and get out of it. If you say I want to go do a PhD to become a professor, then you have to consider then it depends on the country, it depends on the field, but typically maybe just 7% of the people who got a PhD in an engineering field end up becoming full professors. That's a number of a long-term study that they did in the United Kingdom.
Mhm.
For other countries, it may be a little bit more difficult to trash out the numbers because you really need to look at a long cohort study to see who ends up as a full professor. So the number generally is very small, but there's much more things that you can do after your PhD with that knowledge. So a lot of it depends on what you want to get out of it, what you want to learn, what you want your experience to be. And I think based on those considerations, you can make a better guess or a better choice on where to go and study.
Yeah, I'm very surprised that number is so low for full professors that take get a PhD, which begs the question: what do the other 93% of PhD students go and do out in the industry?
Mm-hmm. There's many of them go into industry. They become practicing engineers. They may start their own companies. They may become consultants. They some people with say PhDs in stats heavy fields. Some of them
Mhm.
historians end up as business consultants. So it really depends on the skills that you learn. Um, some of them become go work in government. Some of them start to work in the what they call alternative academic careers, such as the publishing industry, um, libraries, anything really more related to the academic field, but not in academia itself. And some people just go do something completely different. They travel the world, become a baker, become
Mhm.
yoga teachers. That it's all possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I'm still surprised kind of the large amount of students or PhD students that go into the industry because in my mind, and I've heard this from many people, it's very hard to find an entry level position as a PhD student just because you are basically overqualified for any entry level position, and it's harder to find a job. Have you seen anything related like that in your experience, maybe with your students, and maybe what are ways they have overcome that maybe misconception that PhD students are just overqualified for an entry level position?
Yes, that's certainly something that at times plays a role. Um, and a lot of it depends as well on what you as a candidate can show company what you can bring to the table. The
Hmm.
example that I gave somebody, for example, with a PhD in history, you may say, well, what skills do you have? What can you contribute to my company if I'm the person looking to hire somebody? And if you as a candidate then can say, for example, I have very strong skills in statistics, which I can apply to any set of problems. I'm a very good communicator because I've written technical articles, I've presented my work at conferences. If you can really show the industry what you've learned in the PhD and how those skills really add value to a company, then I think that misconception of this is somebody who spent the last 3 or 4 years in the basements doing some weird experiments, that goes away then.
Yeah, and I can see. I mean, the experience you learn doing research is invaluable, especially with just related to structure. There is just so many things to learn that even if you have a lot of years experience, sometimes you don't get the time and the ability to dive deep into some of these really detailed, I don't know, connections or really special beam and reinforced concrete design, just because you
Mm-hmm.
have to be pushing projects out and you have to be kind of keeping up with all your work. So I think there's room for definitely room for PhD students to find entry level positions, and they may just be a little of adjustment kind of in those early years, but I think it's totally possible. What about the difference between let's say I'm an undergrad student. I am deciding if I want to get a master's degree or if I want to go in the PhD track. What would you say that student, that situation? And I know this is going to vary from person to person, but in your experience, what are the maybe one or two reasons someone should get a master's degree instead of a PhD, and what are one or two reasons someone should get a PhD instead of just staying with their masters?
That's a great question, and um, it is as well depends a lot on the program, the country, etc. But typically, what we can say is that if you are 100% sure you want to dedicate yourself to research, then going into a track of masters and PhD directly could be the right route. But I think as an undergraduate, it may be difficult to have an estimate of what that would entail. So most of the times, the wisest decision may be to go into a master's first, do a smaller research project, see how that feels for you, and then commit to a larger project, because then you already have more skills, you know better what it is like,
Mhm.
and you can make a better informed decision.
Yeah, that's very true. And I actually had a kind of a mini series early on this podcast. I'll make sure I link it in the show notes and on the website. But um, I first presented 4 reasons for students that they should go to graduate school, because there's definitely a room for that for many students, especially if they're. I feel like in structural engineering is almost required at this point to get a master's degree. Then I talked to one of my friends that has a very similar path to the one I have. We both started like in building design, and now we moved into bridges, which is a completely different world. And I ended up getting a master's degree, but she didn't get her master's degree. And I feel like we're close in our careers, and it just made sense for her to just start working right away. And then I presented just 4 reasons why you shouldn't go to graduate school, and just kind of um, some of the reasons in terms of like financial, family, just different reasons why maybe someone shouldn't go to grad school. So if anyone of you are listening and want to go back to those episodes, I'll make sure I link them in the show notes. But it just shows that there is not really a right answer for one person. It just depends on your personal situation, and it depends on what you want to get out of this either master's degree or PhD program, and where you want to go in your career. Um, you
Mhm.
mentioned, and we kind of talk about this a little offline, that you're in Quito right now doing, you're a full professor at the university over there. How's that experience been? I know you did some research here in the US. Maybe talk us through the difference between the research here in the US and the research in Quito, and just kind of overall your experience being a full professor down there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And when I arrived here in 2013, our university did not have a laboratory at all. So our students who
Mhm.
were competing in the ACI competition, the concrete competition, they were actually mixing concrete somewhere outside of a building, because they at that point they did not have any place for that. So one of the first things that I focused on when I arrived here was to actually make sure we get a space and some equipment for doing laboratory work and involving students as much as possible. And over the years, a lot of my work really has evolved here around integrating students into research, integrating students into lab work, so that they can get a better idea of um, what it really feels like, everything that they learn inside the classroom. And of course, with the facilities that we have, which is less than, for example, what we have in the laboratory in the Netherlands, we are able to do the work that more than anything raises a curiosity in students. And I think that in itself is perhaps a different goal and a different achievement than doing large series of experiments, which I do in my summers in the Netherlands. But it's
Mhm.
something that I find very fulfilling.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a completely different experience between the US, the Netherlands, and Ecuador right now. I'm curious, how's the funding work? I know here in the United States, there's a lot of money that goes into research for master's and PhD programs, and I personally got my master's paid for with a grant and doing research. How does that work down in Ecuador, and is there any funding for students that are doing research?
So when it comes down to master's and PhD programs, there are very few programs available in the country. Our university just started the master's, and it's a master of engineering, not a master of science, in
Hmm.
structures with really focus on seismic safety, because Ecuador is a seismic country.
Yeah.
When it
There's
comes
a
to
lot of
really,
seismic in the Andes mountains.
yes, yes.
Colombia is it's very very high seismic zone, which is
Mhm.
yeah.
Sweet. I have felt a few earthquakes by now, that in the
Yeah.
time that I've been living here. Hmm. And when it comes to the students who really want to pursue research and go do a master's of science, they typically go abroad. And to go abroad,
Hmm.
there used to be a funding program from the Ecuadorian government to support students that go study abroad. Um, some of them apply, for example, to the Fulbright to go study in the United States. Some of them may obtain funding to go study directly as a research assistant or teaching assistant at a university in the United States. And some of them get, for example, an excellent scholarship to go study in Europe by funded by their a university in Europe then. So for them, it really comes down to finding where the opportunities are, and what is available within the country is limited, but there many students are more than happy to bring excellent students to come over and work. So there's when somebody is really driven to go study something, then there are the opportunities internationally to go and pursue that dream.
So it's mainly the government kind of paying for them to go, let's say, here in the US or somewhere in Europe, rather than maybe bringing the money to these universities within Ecuador to do the research in house. And are there any conditions for the students that get this kind of funding in terms of like they have to come back and work in Ecuador, or they have to do something like that, or is it just they just pay for it and they can just maybe stay here in the US working?
For those then that were on the program that was organized by the government, which at this point is discontinued, they did have the requirement to come back and stay.
Hmm.
I think I think it was a function of the number of years that they spent outside the country that they had to return. And
Okay.
um, at times it was difficult for them because, of course, the number of, for example, academic positions is limited, and for some of them, it took some time to figure out how to position themselves in the industry, start their own business, make a name for themselves. But I think it has resulted in a lot of growth here.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, and I've heard programs like that. Some of the universities, some of the people I went to school in here in the U.S. have had similar programs like that, where they kind of get funding to study somewhere else, and then they just kind of either have to come back and work for a certain amount of years, kind of what you're explaining, or there's just
Mm-hmm.
some different requirements. So I think that's pretty interesting. What about in terms of the research? Have you seen a difference in research? I'm sure there is a lot more concrete and maybe a little bit of still research done in Ecuador. I'm sure it's similar in Ecuador, but in Colombia, there's a lot of concrete construction and with high seismic zones and everything. I'm sure there's a lot of concrete research. Have you seen a difference between when you were maybe a student here in the US and the research you're doing now between the kind of the two places in terms of what research has been done?
Uh, as you already said, the focus here in Ecuador is really on the fact that it's a seismic country and everything that entails, from rehabilitation after an earthquake. We had in 2016, 5 years ago, we had a
Hmm.
large earthquake in the coast of Ecuador. So then there was a lot of exploration and um, making decisions whether or not buildings are still safe and all the procedures around that, which sparked um, research. There's as well, for the historic cities, there's always the questions whether we have to do something additional to protect the historical buildings and the cultural patrimony if there's a seismic risk, or what would be the magnitude of earthquake that um, would potentially destroy certain parts of the historical city center. And that's really the focus of most of the research here. Now, my field is not
Hmm.
seismic engineering, it's really bridges and shear problems and load testing. And I found that because the infrastructure and the bridges in Ecuador tend to be a bit younger than, for example, in Europe, there is less of a pressing need to invest in research related to existing bridges. So I do find that sometimes when I get the opportunity to speak at a conference or anything locally, I always try to bring the message that you don't just build a bridge and turn your back to it and just let it
Mhm.
stand there until one day it doesn't look good anymore. You have to give it some tender loving care and give it maintenance just as
Mhm.
you do with your car so that it can have a longer service life. And that's what I've been focusing on in these years, trying to bring that message, because there's not really the culture yet of really investing in the maintenance and management programs for the existing bridges and the bridge network.
Yeah, that's very true. And I know, I mean, we have the same issues in Colombia, and growing up, I mean, you see kind of brand new bridges, and they never touch them for 5, 10, 15 years after they build them, and think they're going to be performing well for another 40, 50 years. Here
Mm-hmm.
in the US, I mean, we maintain bridges every 2 years, like full on inspection. And even though there's a huge backlog in infrastructure here in the US, there's still a lot of money that gets poured into new bridges, maintenance, and everything. And I think that's something that South America and maybe other countries have like need to learn and realize. So I think that's a very important topic to be touching on. One other question I have for you is, being a student, an international student doing a PhD program here in the US. What was that like? What was your experience doing that PhD program? I know as an international student myself, when I was doing a master's degree and doing research, this was a completely different world to what I had seen kind of back in Colombia growing up, and just coming to university here was a huge change. I want to hear kind of your perspective doing a PhD program, and probably the amount of research and in detail research that was done. I'm sure that was a big challenge in your career.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I eased into it because I did two masters first and then a PhD. So I already knew a
Hmm.
little bit what to expect, but I also did not know what to expect at the same time.
Yeah.
I think the thing that took me most by surprise was, and that's very typical of the way the PhD is structured in the Netherlands, is that it is it the focus really is on the research, and you are pretty much thrown into the deep end of the pool and go figure it out. And I got thrown figuratively into the laboratory with all the tools there and the nice budget to do a full series of large scale experiments. And I had to learn along the way everything from what it entails to do experiments. I had been doing analytical work previously, so I was not an experimentalist until I started my PhD. So I had to learn what it means to be an experimentalist and what that practically means in terms of just dealing with a lot of data and knowing what to get out of your data and how to process that and how to store that and everything. At the same time, of course, I had to learn how to keep track of my progress, keep my project moving forward. My supervisors were rather just letting me figure it out for myself. They just
Hmm.
uh, let me have fun by myself, which was very nice because it gave me the opportunity to explore what I found interesting and to develop my the model that then I developed, the um, theoretical model. They did not give input on that. They just said, well, come up with a theory and we'll see what you bring us. And the amount of confidence that they gave me and the time and uh, tools that they gave me to look at that was quite nice. But at times it of course feels a little bit overwhelming because there is so much to explore, and how do you know what to address in your research?
Yeah, I know for me it was pretty daunting to just dive into this new research topic, and trying to figure out everything from scratch, and knowing that the advisor doesn't really have the answers. He can give you some guidance, but at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
you're the one that has to get all the answers. And a lot of times you're kind of spending multiple hours either just looking up literature reviews, papers, and reading, and sometimes in the lab, and just trying and failing and trying and failing, which is a lot of times exhausting. So I know research and just overall the being a professor and doing research is not easy. It's a lot of work. And um, I saw that during my masters, and I was done there, and I think it was a good
Mhm.
good career path for me just to get in the industry. But I'm glad that you're doing 2 masters and a PhD program. That's a lot. How have you managed your time? Now you're working in Quito. You also work in the Netherlands. Um, you must have some really intricate time management systems kind of in place when you're doing all of these things at the same time.
I do. I live and die by my calendars because otherwise things get just too messy. And a lot of what I do is based on having a template for my week, which is really a layout of blocks of different responsibilities that I have. And I also use some tools to organize my tasks, which are divided into the same uh, categories of work tasks, and my email folders go in the same categories of folders as well, so that I know that within 1 week I do have the time to do everything that I need to do, which is, of course, teaching, supervising my students, service commitments that I have. I have an administrative role within my university here in Ecuador as well. I of course, have to do some additional administration. I do my own research. I write my articles. I check the articles of my other students. So that may sound like a lot, but I have my template in place there, and I know that when everything sounds like a lot, I know that within the framework of a week, I do manage to organize my time in such a way that I have my set time blocks to deal, for example, with the emails of my students, or for example, with my service commitments.
I love that this topic. I could talk about apps and systems and everything. So I'm curious what kind of apps you use for all of these, if you don't mind me asking.
Sure. Um, and I could talk about that for an entire day as well. So I hope I don't go too long here. But generally, what I use is I use Google Calendar for having that layout of the week. I also have my Outlook calendar of work, which I synchronize those just by adding my 2 email addresses to, or 3 email addresses to my calendar invite, so that everything synchronizes across these calendars. When it comes to task management, what I use is Todoist, which is the app and the website that I use. And then I use I use a lot of analog systems as well. So when it comes down to really planning my year, my semester, my month, my week, and my day, I also make lists in just a planner that I have, as well as in I take down my plan for the day into my physical agenda, so that I don't have to be seeing everything on the computer all the time. And additionally, what I use for really seeing how I've spent my time and to look back on how I really used my time, I use Toggle Track. And that is a time tracking application that I use then to, at the end of the month, for example, to see what was the breakdown of the month, or at the end of the year to see, for example, for 2020, I saw, yes, it was a very teaching heavy year because of the pandemic. It took me a lot of time to adjust my material, and that I saw back in my reports then.
Yeah, I love Toggle Track. I have it on my I use my iPad for 95% of everything I do.
Mm-hmm.
There's very few things that I haven't been able to do with the iPad just because of the limitations, like these kind of things. Just recording a podcast, a video is not very good for it, but using like shortcuts in the iPad is an amazing tool. I can just do so many things. I can hit a command and it will create a folder. I use Things3 for my task management. I also use Toggle Track for my just keeping track of all these podcast projects and my work projects during the day. Um, and it creates a list on Notion, which I use for like project management and just keeping track of all the things that I have going on in my life. So with a single command, all of those actions take place, which is amazing because I don't have to do anything. Otherwise, it will take me like 5 or 10 minutes every time I create a new project. So um, I I'm happy to hear that someone else uses Toggle Track because I don't think a lot of people use that, and it's an amazing, and I
Mm-hmm.
think it's completely free. I don't know if you use the paid version, but I use the free version and it works
I
amazing.
use
I
free
have
version. Mm-hmm.
all my work projects that I work during the day, like my day job, and then each podcast gets its own project, and that way I can keep track of how much time I'm spending editing and doing all these things, and it really brings everything kind of in perspective, and you sometimes you don't realize where all your time is going, and so if you track it, it's always there, and it's just so easy. So I'm happy that you use kind of a similar system because I don't think a lot of people that at least have interviewed here in the podcast have kind of that kind of systems. Something I like to do a lot also is like a
Mhm.
weekly review and like a monthly review. Do you have some sort of like review process you do somewhat consistently, just for either research or just personally?
Yes, I do. I at the end of every week, so on Friday afternoon, I have set aside time where I do a quick review of what I did over the last week and then write down my five main priorities for the upcoming week in what is work. So I those five categories that I have are writing, research, teaching, service, and admin. And then I also
Mhm.
have a relationships category, which is just anything that is family and social, and a self category where I just write down two things that I want to focus on of my own projects, and whether that's sports that I'm doing or any type of thing that I'm exploring at the moment, so that I also know that I have time besides work and all the responsibilities for finding time for fun for myself. And at the end of the month, I do a bit of a larger review. I look back at what I have in Toggle Track, how I spent my time over the month. I look at what I had planned for the month, and I look at what I achieved of that plan, what I didn't achieve, what went well, and what didn't go well. And I really reflect on those four prompts to see what I can learn from the month that has passed and how I can then change or adjust my plans for the month that is to come.
Yeah, that's a great way. I try to do a weekly review also, just kind of pretty high level, just seeing how the week went, and maybe do a little planning for like the following week. Make sure I'm staying on top of it. I have a day job, so I work until 5 p.m. and then at night I kind of do these podcasts and blog and writing and volunteer and everything. So having a kind of bird's eye view each week of what's going on around uh, all the things that I'm doing is just super important, and it's just very valuable for me. And I've tried to kind of consolidate it and just kind of make it really simple, 5-10 minutes max, because otherwise it just takes a lot of time and it's a lot of friction to kind of get it through. I could stay talking about this
Mhm.
topic for hours and hours. So I just want to ask you one more question, and maybe we'll have to do a second part down the road about this very topic. But how do you boost productivity? I know you kind of mentioned some of the tools you use. What are some of those strategies? I'm sure doing research and being a professor takes a lot of time. I know you have your own podcast as well, a blog and everything. So what are some of these strategies you implement to get all of these things done as a professor?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And sometimes when people look at the things that I do, they, for example, they ask me, "You never sleep," or things like that, and that's not the case. I do have what I like to call a rich life with a lot of things in it, but I'm happy with how that works out. And what is crucial for me is really to have those systems in place to know what I should be working on when, to have it very well defined in advance that during my research block of the day, I am going to look at this data and work on developing this table. So I know precisely what I want to achieve. When I have my service block, I know, okay, I'm going to clean through the service folder on in my mailbox and get through all these
Mhm.
emails. If I know that I have to review a number of papers, I need to set aside the time for that. And when you know exactly what to do during a certain amount of time, then you're less distracted by, for example, email, because when I'm working on research, I will have my mailbox closed, for example. My phone is in a different room, and I will just focus on my research and get it done. And then when I'm sorting through emails, that's a time that I may have my phone with me, and then I that I will reply messages and reply emails, and I batch things so that I don't get constantly distracted and disrupted. And I think with that way, I can keep focused on my research and get the work done in the time that I plan for it.
Yeah, that's some things that I found also very useful. Just time blocking, and not only just time blocking, but have like assigning tasks and goals for those time blocks. I
Mm-hmm.
recently read the book Deep Work, which I'm sure you have heard of it. It's an amazing
Mm-hmm.
book of just finding like that state of mind, like that flow state into just the things you're working on. And I know I've struggled with just kind of stay focused during work, especially like during the day, or if I'm working late or something. It's just hard to stay focused. But once you assign those tasks and your goals to like the time block, it just makes it a lot easier to gain momentum and just kind of get all those things kind of out of the way. Also, time like batching is crucial for what I do. I try to record a podcast and maybe do like the intro and the outros. I kind of do that separate, and so having everything. If I have to set it up once and I do all of the things at once, is gonna be a lot more efficient than if I record these and then maybe I go and write for a little bit and then maybe come back and record something else the next day. It's a lot harder to kind of get into a good momentum and something like that. So I do a lot of things too. I do a lot of volunteering, and I've heard kind of the same comments. Like people think that I don't sleep. I have two children, and just a lot of things kind of going on. But I try to consolidate things that I do for what makes sense for me and for what I'm volunteering, and mostly everything is just around engineering and a lot around like helping students. So it's not like I'm splitting my effort into too many things that are out of my uh, set of expertise, if you call it like that. It's more consolidating the things that I do into one main topic where I can kind of stay in the same mindset doing all of these things. So I think the strategy you said is exactly kind of similar to what I'm doing, and I think again I could stay talking about this all day long. But do you have any last words about this topic before we kind of close this episode?
Yeah, I think we can summarize it by saying a lot comes down to intentionality, being really putting the intention on what you want to achieve, what is really important for you, and going one layer deeper. That means aligning your work and everything that you do with your values, and
Hmm.
seeing if you have to make choices, bring it back to that.
Yeah, if it's not a heck yes, it's a no for me. And
Hmm.
it's an amazing book, also an amazing concept, because it really keeps you grounded and focus on what you really want to be doing, not distracted doing other things around your life. So I just want to say thank you for coming and talking to the podcast. I had a lot of fun just talking about all of these topics. PhD programs are something that I know a lot of people are interested in. It's personal, my cup of tea. I like doing work and everything, but I know this is a really important topic. So that's what I wanted you to be here on the podcast and just talking about all these tools and everything. Again, I could stay talking for hours and hours on this. I just have one last question for you, and that's how can we continue engineering our future?
I think by learning from the mistakes from the past, by looking at what is available in terms of the research that has been done on new materials, solutions, putting that into practice and develop buildings and bridges that are sustainable and that will be able to withstand the threats that a changing climate will bring to them.
Yeah, that sounds great. I ask this question on every episode, and I'm always mind blown by the great insight I get from all the guests on the show. So, again, thank you so much for coming to the podcast, and just you're doing some amazing things, and it's been a joy talking to you today. Where can people find you online? Where can they reach out to you if they have any other questions, and where they can just find you online?
Yeah, people can find me on my website, evalantsocht.com, where I have my blog. You can find my podcast, which is called PhD Talk, through all the regular places where you can find your podcast. You can find me on Twitter with my name, Eva Lantsocht, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and on Facebook as PhD Talk.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll make sure I link everything so people can find it super easy. But yeah, thank you for coming to the podcast, and it's been amazing talking to you today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.